law ever become a reality in America? Some fear any nuclear, biological, or chemical attack on U.S. territory might trigger just that. And as KSLA News 12 Jeff Farrell discovered, the clergy would help the government with potentially their biggest problem, us.
We ought to be telling the truth about what's going on.
We know that our temples and mosques and churches and synagogues draw large numbers of people. And so we want to provide them not only with information, but to get a sense of their capacity to handle emergencies.
Were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster? Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir.
The local F.E.M.A director, the M.A director for our county, is my wife's personal friend. And she invited me to come. So I went to the meeting thinking I'll go there and blow it off. But what I heard that first meeting just absolutely shocked me. She opened the meeting with this, and she just clearly said, you know, we're looking to bring people in, pastors, because we have things we have to deal with that we can't deal with because you guys are the spiritual professionals. You can talk to people like we can't. And I said, so what are you looking for? She goes, we're looking to train the pastors so we can get them trained the right way, to give the right kind of counseling, the right kind of spiritual, mental health care in times of disaster. And I made the choice to stay there and listen as they brought in a man from the state office, and he began to teach us these things. He said, what we're going to look for is how to train pastors in dealing with the individualist mentality that takes place in a community, especially farm and rural communities. As you know, the cowboy mentality. And I was shocked that he would say that to us. And someone said, what do you mean a cowboy mentality? He goes, you know the one that says this is my land, not yours? This is my property, not yours? And I'm going, yeah, I understand that thought. And he said, you know, we want you pastors to quell that mentality because we're going to need that to carry through with our plans for disaster relief in the event of bioterrorism. And he said, if the terrorists come to this county, you know, you pastors are the ones who can get your churches ready for any kind of thing that happens, like a quarantine. He goes, and the event in a declared emergency, you know, like martial law. I said, what do you mean martial law? He goes, well, we had this test in Iowa a few years back, and we found out the problem was at the local level. We got no cooperation from the farmers who wanted to give up their crops and their land and their animals. He goes, and for crying out loud, it was just a drill, and they wouldn't give them up. What are they going to do when it's the real thing? Then he tells us he's from a rural community in Ohio, and he is. And he said, this is what we have to do. We have to get you pastors to get your churches prepared for something like that, something like a bioterrorism attack, a flood, a tornado, where people will have to be quarantined or relocated. And so, by the way, we use different terminology. We don't use the term relocation center because that's gone by the wayside. People don't like it. We call them community health centers. One of the ladies of the meeting said, yeah, we don't like to use quarantine. Are you ready for this? You write this one down. Social distancing. That's a quarantine. Social distancing. Don't you love that one? And he says, we want you pastors to begin preparing your congregations. So I was trying to play dumb, and I said, well, how do you figure we're going to do this? And he goes, pastors will be listened to by their congregations. You have their trust now. And so if you've got their trust, you've got their ear. If you've got their ear, you've got their hearts. And I said, you mean to tell me that we're going to preach this? He goes, yeah, and they'll learn and they'll listen to you. And then he said, we're going to train pastors in mental health care, but we know that pastors have trouble with mental health care, so we're going to call it spiritual care in times of disaster. That's the training that pastors, I hate to tell you this, are signing up for left and right.
We ought to be telling the truth about what's going on. But today, in many cases, it's the pastors and pulpits of America that are parroting the government line. The F.E.M.A pastors. You say, I don't know if I really think that that's real, that whole, F.E.M.A pastors. And, I know personally of big mega church pastors that I've known who have said they were contacted and literally brought to the White House and sat down in a meeting with George W. Bush and given their marching orders for what to preach and what they needed to say and what they needed to do. I could tell you, I know it for a fact. You may not think that that's going on. But you know what? They're not stupid. They know that the preachers of America and the pastors of churches have the ear of millions and millions and millions of people across this land. And they have corrupted the pastors of America. They have turned them into government prostitutes of propaganda across the land. It's true. They are hirelings. And I'm going to tell you something. They literally, I'm sure that some of them are just ignorant and maybe their heart's in the right place, but that stupid television has just brainwashed them, or maybe they just don't have time to read this book because they're too busy reading some, feel-good book from the Christian bookstore that's going to tell them about God instead of reading the Holy Bible and figuring out what's really going on. Come on. Come on, read the Bible. When you're listening to liars, you'll never be free. And they're being enslaved because of their unrighteousness, and they're losing freedom. But today, preachers want to preach a feel-good sermon. They literally will parade the police chief and every government mayor, governors, mayors, congressmen, good or bad, they'll parade them across the platform and say, we appreciate your service.
Were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster? Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir?
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was.
May I most respectfully request that matter not be touched upon at this stage.
The President's directives in the event of a national emergency.
There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a New World Order.
I think this is the most broad definition of emergency powers I've ever seen a president award to themselves, and the directives have no indication that to get these powers, the President has to go to Congress. It looks from the language as if the President, on his own declaration, President Bush could just say, well, we have an emergency, and there's some very broad definitions of emergency in the Security and Prosperity Partnership working groups.
To have a plan to provide for the continuity of government and the rule of law in case of a devastating terrorist attack or natural disaster. A plan to provide for the cooperation, the coordination, and continued functioning of all three branches of the government. The Bush administration tells us they have such a plan. They introduced a little sketchy public version that's clearly inadequate and doesn't really tell us what they have in mind. But they said, don't worry, there's a detailed classified version. But now they've denied the entire Homeland Security Committee of the United States House of Representatives access to their so-called detailed plan to provide for continuity of government. They say, trust us.
This will probably set a new standard for all the churches to follow, since the federal government is actually supporting it.
Because if your church has a fire, has an active shooter, has a tornado, a thunderstorm when you're letting the congregation be dismissed following the service, and people are injured or killed in any of these or similar emergencies, the liability of the church is based on whether or not the church complied with a community standard of care. What would reasonable people in similar circumstances do? And so this guide is going to become Exhibit A in assessing your church's response to this wide range of emergencies we're going to be touching on today. This is going to serve as the standard by which your church is going to be judged. To your best efforts, we recommend that you follow the recommendations in here. I know that my son was exiting a church service a few years ago, and there was a tornado on the ground less than a mile away, moving right for the parking lot where hundreds of people were walking out to their vehicles. Nobody in that church had been monitoring this. There was no instruction to the congregation as the service was dismissed what to do. Can you imagine, Jerry, if a tornado had plowed through that parking lot and killed 50 people? Even if it killed just a few people, what the liability to that church would have been?
We'll start off with basically saying that, number one, it comes from the leadership on down. So this plan that you're going to put together has got to be supported by the leadership.
And Jerry, the guide for all of these risks, including active shooters, they give basically, as you say, a kind of a four-step analysis. Number one, how do you prepare for this emergency? Number two, how do you seek to prevent the risk or mitigate the risk? Number three, how do you respond to the risk? And number four, what do you do afterwards? And it's interesting how that kind of template is applied then to most of these risks. Let's start with preparing. And the guide recommends that a church establish an emergency planning team, that the team create an emergency operations plan, that it communicates with first responders, such as your fire department, your police department in your community, and that the church perform exercises and drills.
I know one of the things that they said, you should have diverse representation. I took that a little bit further in representation of key people that will be that will make a difference. Why not have law enforcement present at your services to begin with? Or if you have somebody that is in your congregation that is in law enforcement, why not tell them, please wear your uniform to work?
I think, to me, probably the best way for a church to respond would be to have uniformed law enforcement officers on site during services. Now you say, well, we can't afford that. Well, it's only for a few hours a week. It's not going to be a huge expense, and think of the benefit. You're going to have a highly trained person, trained in the use of firearms, trained in responding to crisis events on your premises. The uniform is a deterrent, at least for some. And I think very importantly is the fact that if a police officer responds to criminal activity, he or she ceases to be an agent of your church and becomes on duty as a law enforcement officer, which cuts off the potential liability for your church if that person uses excessive force, aims poorly and kills innocent people, and is negligent in the use of firearms or responding to a crisis. It really minimizes the church's potential liability. That's why I think uniformed police officers represent the best line of defense here.
Peace and pastors. Dayton turns to a somewhat unlikely partnership, hoping to keep the peace in our streets. Good evening, I'm Mark Allen.
And good evening, I'm Katie Houston. There are high hopes for this unique approach designed to bring compassion to people in pain. Megan O'Rourke is live to tell you about this new initiative in our top story at 5:30.
More than a dozen Dayton area ministers met today for the 4th week of their PAC training. Now, PAC stands for Police and Clergy Together and is a new program aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community, a problem that's plagued Dayton for years.
Yeah, there's no question that synergy will help reduce the distrust. And because we're community leaders and hopefully trusted by our congregations, we're able then to not only talk about this process, but just kind of give an idea of what the police have to deal with on a daily basis to protect our streets. Because, people don't like the police until they need the police.
Concentrated in one area. Mark McGuire is one of about 18 clergy participating in the new program. Now, McGuire tells me not only is it a win-win for the community, but it was also a no-brainer for him to get involved. All of the ministers had to apply for the program and are now going through 10 weeks of training and ride-alongs. Once complete, the clergy will spend at least 16 hours a month riding with officers in cruisers responding to scenes.
I think from a police officer standpoint, it's so important. Sometimes when officers go to like traffic crashes or homicides, it's tough to deal with family when someone has lost a loved one. So I think that's one great benefit too, having the ministers along with the police, during those sad times when someone actually loses their life. They're there to help out, console the family.
Now, the first group of ministers will graduate on October 11th and will immediately start serving. Dayton police tell me even though this is a new program, they already consider it a success and are looking to start a new PACT class early next year.
God of Moses is a poor general. Leave him no retreat.
10 times you have seen the miracles of the Lord, and still you have no faith. He's a false prophet who delivers you to death. Stone him! Stone him!
Listen to Moses! He speaks God's will! They will stop for me.
Charging chariot knows no rank.
Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the wilderness?
Why must we die?
Fear not! Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. The pillar of fire, it is the breath of God. Reach the fire of God. Gather your families and your flocks. We must go with those feet. Go where? Drown in the sea? How long will the fire hold Pharaoh back? After this day, you shall see his chariots no more. No! You'll be dead under them. The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand.
Is it possible that all churches and religion in the United States could be banished or regulated by the federal government as it was in the Soviet Union? A Wall Street lawyer says in a national magazine that we could lose all religious freedom if the present government course continues. In that article, this lawyer was quoted as saying, increasing attempts to regulate churches are in violation of the Constitution. Now, such an attempt was made January the 3rd, 1979, against the Worldwide Church of God, which sponsors this program. We had to fight the battle to preserve the Constitution of the United States, separating church and state. But the real issue has now surfaced. The whole question is, who is Lord? Is it Caesar or is Christ Lord? And that is going to have to be settled in the United States. And that is the real question at issue now. Who is Lord?